Naomi's triumph and tension. Naomi Carter's fingers tightened around her boarding pass as she stepped toward the gate. She had traveled these paths before, walked through countless airports, and sat in the economy section on every flight she'd ever been on. Each trip had reminded her of how far she had come from where she started. From a small apartment in a neighborhood that hadn't offered many opportunities, to now holding this ticket in her hand, a seat in the first-class cabin. It was more than a luxury, it was a milestone. A moment where she could finally breathe, knowing her hard work had paid off. The last few years had been a blur of late nights, early mornings, missed vacations, and sleepless flights. But the sacrifices had finally led to this. This was her reward for pushing herself every single day, not letting setbacks define her, and building a career that demanded respect. Today, she was in a space she had earned, a seat in the front of the plane, just like the executives and the stars. It felt like she had finally arrived. Her mind wandered for a brief moment as she took her seat, her eyes scanning the cabin around her. The polished leather, the crisp white linens on the trays, and the smile from the flight attendants all conveyed a sense of calm. But as Naomi settled into the soft, wide chair, she noticed something strange. People were staring. It wasn't the typical glance someone might give in a crowded space, it was the kind of stare that lingered too long, and in some cases, even seemed to carry a hint of judgment. Naomi had long since grown used to people's scrutiny. In an industry dominated by certain types of people, she had often found herself feeling like an outsider. But today, it felt different. The looks she was receiving weren't just curious. They were loaded. Her heart began to race, though she remained outwardly composed. She did what she always did, stood tall, refused to shrink. She had worked too hard to be made to feel small now. The momentary anxiety faded into determination as Naomi adjusted the hem of her jacket and placed her bag carefully by her feet. But it was only moments before the first hint of tension broke the calm. A flight attendant approached Naomi with a swift pace, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed and sharp. Naomi looked up at her, sensing something was amiss. The attendant, a young woman with an aura of authority, stopped right beside her seat, an unreadable expression on her face. Naomi felt the sudden, electric tension in the air between them. "Excuse me, ma'am," the flight attendant began, her voice cutting through the ambient hum of the plane. "This is a first-class seat. Are you sure this is your ticket?" Naomi blinked, momentarily caught off guard. It wasn't the kind of greeting she had expected. She had presented her boarding pass at check-in and had been assured that everything was in order. "I'm positive," Naomi replied calmly, holding out her boarding pass without hesitation. "This is my seat." The flight attendant eyed the pass with a disinterested glance, but then, instead of simply confirming the information, she stared back at Naomi with an expression that made Naomi's stomach churn. "Are you sure?" the attendant repeated, louder this time, drawing the attention of the passengers nearby. Naomi could hear the shuffle of feet and the murmur of voices, as if people were beginning to notice the exchange. Naomi's face flushed. She could feel the eyes of the surrounding passengers on her. Some appeared curious, others uncomfortable, but one thing was certain, this was no ordinary questioning. There was an edge to it, a layer of skepticism in the attendant's tone that Naomi couldn't ignore. She hadn't said anything, hadn't moved or behaved in any way that warranted suspicion, and yet, this woman was questioning her as if she didn't belong here. "I assure you, I belong here," Naomi said again, her voice steady, her hand extended toward the flight attendant with the boarding pass. "I paid for this ticket, and it's clearly marked on my reservation." But the attendant wasn't satisfied. Her eyes narrowed, and she leaned in closer, almost as if to get a better look at Naomi, as though she were scrutinizing her every feature. The voice that followed was louder, sharper. "I don't think this is right," she said. "You're sitting in first class, and I just don't see how that's possible." Naomi's heart began to pound. The words rang in her ears as the tension on the plane seemed to rise. The attendant's doubt was clear, and though Naomi could feel the eyes of the passengers growing heavier with each passing moment, she stood her ground. She had earned this seat, and she wasn't going to let anyone tell her otherwise. At this point, Naomi's mind raced. She had been in situations before where she felt the weight of being judged, being seen as out of place, but she never expected it to happen here. This was supposed to be the ultimate reward for her success, not a place for questions, for accusations. She couldn't help but wonder, was this about the seat? Or was it something else? "Excuse me," Naomi said, her voice tinged with both patience and frustration. "I've already shown you my boarding pass. I'm sitting here because I purchased this ticket. If you need confirmation, I'm happy to speak with a manager." The attendant hesitated, her eyes flickering between Naomi and the growing group of passengers around them. The murmurs were unmistakable now. Some passengers were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged confused glances. The tension was palpable, and Naomi could feel the spotlight burn hotter. The attendant seemed undecided, but the questioning didn't stop. She crossed her arms, looking Naomi up and down as if trying to decipher whether this woman belonged in the plush leather seats of first class. In that moment, Naomi realized something fundamental. This wasn't about a boarding pass. It wasn't about whether or not her ticket was valid. It was about the assumption that someone like her, someone who didn't fit the traditional image of privilege in the airline's mind, could somehow have a place in this exclusive space. It was bias. It was discrimination, and it was raw. Naomi's mind was awash with emotions, anger, frustration, and a deep, familiar sadness. She had worked so hard, and yet, here she was, being made to feel small. Her thoughts, however, were cut short when she heard a voice break through the confrontation. "I've been informed of the situation," the voice said, calm and commanding. Naomi turned her head to see a man in a sharp suit, the airline's executive manager, approaching with measured steps. He didn't look like he was rushing, but there was a clear authority in his presence. Naomi's eyes met his, and for a moment, the weight of everything seemed to hang in the balance. The manager stopped beside Naomi and turned his gaze toward the flight attendant. "I've reviewed the situation, and I'll be handling this from here," he said firmly. The flight attendant opened her mouth to protest, but the words died on her lips. The manager turned to Naomi with a gentle smile, offering an apologetic nod. "I'm terribly sorry for the trouble, ma'am," he said. "Please, enjoy your flight. I will ensure no further disruptions." Naomi nodded, still in disbelief, and watched as the manager signaled for the flight attendant to step aside. Then, without further hesitation, he spoke the words that no one could have predicted. "You're dismissed," he said to the attendant, his tone calm but unmistakably final. The flight attendant's face went pale. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Naomi could hear the whispers from the nearby passengers, the incredulity in their voices. They had witnessed the entire confrontation, and they were just as stunned by the manager's decisive response. The flight attendant stumbled back, looking like she wanted to argue, to explain herself. But the manager's gaze was unwavering. "I said you're dismissed," he repeated, his voice low but firm. "You're no longer employed here." The silence that followed was almost suffocating. No one in the cabin spoke. No one moved. The attendant, visibly humiliated, turned and left without another word. Naomi was left alone with her thoughts, her mind spinning as she tried to process everything that had just unfolded. The events had moved so fast, so unexpectedly, that she felt as if she were in a dream. For the first time in a long while, Naomi allowed herself to feel something else, a sense of relief. A small but undeniable victory had been won, not just for her, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel less than they were because of the color of their skin or the assumptions others held about them. The aftermath. The silence that followed the manager's firm dismissal of the flight attendant seemed to stretch for an eternity. Naomi sat there, absorbing the gravity of what had just happened. Her heart was still pounding, and her thoughts felt jumbled as the enormity of the situation began to settle in. What had just occurred? Had the airline really just taken a stand in front of so many witnesses? Naomi couldn't help but replay the events over and over in her mind, as if looking for some piece of the puzzle that would explain it all. As the flight attendants resumed their duties, Naomi slowly leaned back in her seat. She tried to calm her racing pulse, but every part of her body still buzzed with the adrenaline of the confrontation. The sound of the cabin crew moving up and down the aisles, the hum of the engine starting to roar to life, and the clinking of seatbelt buckles all seemed distant, muffled somehow. It was as though Naomi had entered another world where everything felt both incredibly real and surreal at the same time. Passengers nearby, who had witnessed the entire ordeal, began to speak in hushed tones, their words bouncing around Naomi like echoes. Some murmured in support, nodding to each other with raised eyebrows as they recognized the injustice. Others seemed unsure, perhaps not fully understanding the gravity of what had just unfolded. It was hard to ignore the small but undeniable shift in the air. Naomi, though grateful for the resolution, felt like a silent witness to the ripple effects that would follow. The entire incident was already sparking conversations that would go far beyond the confines of this flight. As the plane began its taxi down the runway, Naomi couldn't help but wonder what would happen when the story reached the broader public. What would the media, the online world, and everyday people think about this moment? What would they say about the flight attendants' actions and the swift decision made by the airline's executive manager? The flight was smooth, but Naomi couldn't shake the events from her mind. 1,000 thoughts raced through her head, all tumbling over one another. Her personal triumph had somehow turned into something larger, something that carried weight. She had just experienced a blatant act of bias, but it was also an act that had been called out and swiftly dealt with. Could it be that there was hope for change? Could this moment inspire a shift in the way people saw others, especially those who often felt marginalized? As the hours passed, Naomi reflected on her life up until this point. The struggles, the challenges, and the battles that seemed so insurmountable at times. Every obstacle she had overcome had led her to this very seat. And now, despite the humiliation she had experienced earlier, she realized this moment had been a turning point, not just for her, but for a much larger conversation that was already beginning to unfold. Back in the airline's headquarters, the fallout from the incident was beginning to take shape. The phone lines rang incessantly, as news outlets, both mainstream and social media, picked up on the story. In the age of instant communication, word of what had transpired spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. What was initially seen by some passengers as a small, isolated event was quickly being discussed across the globe. Social media platforms were flooded with comments, hashtags, and opinions. The conversation was loud and heated. People from all walks of life shared their perspectives, discussing their own experiences with bias, discrimination, and prejudice. Some saw Naomi's experience as a clear example of racial profiling, a painful reminder of how society often judged people based on the color of their skin. Others celebrated the airline's swift response, praising the company for not hesitating to take action when the situation became clear. As the hashtag Naomi deserves respect began to trend, Naomi's story was quickly framed not just as a personal injustice but as a symbol of something far greater. It became a story of resilience, of standing up for one's rights, and of demanding equal treatment in every space. Naomi, however, didn't have time to follow the growing media frenzy. She was focused on herself, her well-being, and how she could process everything that had just happened. But what she didn't expect was the personal outpouring of support she would receive from people she had never met. Messages flooded her inbox and social media accounts, some from strangers, others from people who had followed her career for years. They told her how her courage had inspired them to confront their own biases, to challenge authority when necessary, and to stand tall no matter the circumstances. One message stood out. It was from an older woman, a retired teacher, who wrote, "Dear Naomi, you may not know this, but today you did something extraordinary. You stood up, not just for yourself, but for every single person who has ever been made to feel less because of their appearance. I've spent my life trying to teach my students to never accept less than what they deserve, and seeing you do that today reminds me that the fight is never over. You are a role model, and you are not alone." Naomi wiped away a tear as she read the message. She had never considered herself a role model, but in this moment, it felt as though she had become part of something much larger than herself. The outpouring of support only reinforced the idea that the injustice she had faced was not an isolated incident. It was part of a bigger pattern, one that so many people had experienced, one that needed to be addressed. Meanwhile, the airline's public relations team was working tirelessly to manage the growing media storm. Statements were issued, and interviews were scheduled with senior executives who wanted to address the incident head-on. They had learned from this experience, they said. It was a stark reminder of the work that still needed to be done in order to address bias, both within their own ranks and in society as a whole. In the midst of the corporate whirlwind, Naomi received a call from the airline's executive manager. He introduced himself formally and apologized once again for the distress the situation had caused her. "I want you to know," he said, "we are taking immediate action. The incident you were involved in has prompted a company-wide review of training procedures. Our staff will undergo additional diversity and sensitivity training to ensure that something like this never happens again. I also wanted to personally thank you for your patience and poise. You handled the situation with grace, and it made a difference." Naomi nodded, though she wasn't sure whether to feel relief or resentment. The apology was appreciated, but it didn't erase the feeling of being wronged in the first place. "I appreciate that," she said, "but the most important thing is that people continue to learn. If this experience can make a difference, then maybe something positive can come from it." The conversation ended on a hopeful note. The airline's acknowledgement of the issue was a step in the right direction, but Naomi knew that the journey didn't end with an apology. This was part of a larger, ongoing fight for equality. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for everyone who had been made to feel out of place or less than. As the flight continued toward its destination, Naomi looked out the window, her thoughts still swirling. The horizon stretched before her, an endless possibility of new beginnings. She had been questioned, humiliated, and challenged, but she had stood firm. She had won, not just because the airline had acted swiftly, but because she had refused to be diminished. And as the airplane began its descent toward its landing, Naomi felt something shift deep within her, a quiet, resolute understanding that she was part of something bigger than herself. The world was changing, and maybe, just maybe, this was the moment when she could help shape it. The ripple effect. The plane touched down smoothly on the runway, and the cabin buzzed with the sound of seatbelt buckles being unfastened. Naomi had been lost in thought during the remainder of the flight, her mind still processing the events that had unfolded and the wave of attention that had already begun to surround her. As the seatbelt sign flickered off and the passengers began to gather their belongings, Naomi felt a deep sense of exhaustion settle over her, though it wasn't from the flight itself. It was the weight of everything that had transpired, the emotional and mental toll of the confrontation, the backlash, and now, the global ripple effect that seemed to be unfolding. As she disembarked, Naomi noticed the small but telling signs that things had already changed. The airport staff, who would normally be preoccupied with their duties, looked at her with more than just the typical politeness. Some of them nodded in recognition, while others seemed unsure of what to say. She couldn't help but wonder if the incident was already circulating in the offices, the staff rooms, and beyond. News traveled quickly, and the ripple of that moment on the plane was already beginning to wash over the broader public. The media outlets had already picked up the story, spinning it in various directions, some more supportive of Naomi than others. The hashtag Naomi deserves respect had trended globally within hours, becoming a rallying cry for those who saw her story as emblematic of the struggles that marginalized people face on a daily basis. Social media posts poured in from across the world, sharing similar stories of bias and discrimination. Naomi found herself unexpectedly at the center of a conversation that was both personal and global. But despite the overwhelming support, Naomi was also confronted with the harsh reality of the criticism and skepticism that often comes with being thrust into the public eye. Some posts were dismissive, questioning whether her experience was really an act of racial profiling, while others suggested that she had somehow overreacted to a misunderstanding. She knew that these opinions came with the territory of being a public figure, but it stung nonetheless. Her own experience had been real, raw, and painful, and it wasn't something that could be reduced to a simple misunderstanding. It was a reflection of a larger systemic issue that so many people had been silently enduring for far too long. Naomi sat in the back of a taxi on her way home, the steady hum of the city outside offering no comfort to the whirlwind of thoughts that consumed her. Her phone buzzed repeatedly, notifications flooding in from all directions. Her mind felt like it was spinning, caught between the weight of the social media storm and her desire to return to some semblance of normalcy. She could feel her phone vibrating again, this time from a message she didn't expect. It was from her mother. "Naomi, I just saw the news. I'm so proud of you for standing up for yourself. But please be careful. The world is changing, but not everyone will see it the way we do. You've always been strong, and this is just another challenge you'll face. But don't lose yourself in all the noise, okay? You've already proven so much." Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. Her mother's words grounded her, reminding her that, while the world could be unforgiving, her roots, her values, and her sense of self were hers to keep. Her mother's voice, calm and nurturing, had always been the one thing that could give her peace amid any storm. Naomi sent a quick reply, telling her she loved her and that she was okay. But even as she typed the words, she wasn't entirely sure they were true. When Naomi arrived home, she walked through the door, her apartment quiet in contrast to the frenzy that had been building around her. The walls, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed to close in on her. She dropped her bag on the couch and collapsed onto the chair by the window, looking out at the city skyline. The view, which had once been her comfort after long, grueling days, now felt distant. As the days went by, Naomi's story continued to grow, fueled by interviews, articles, and discussions that kept her in the spotlight. Some were well-meaning, seeking to amplify her voice and the deeper issues she had been forced to confront. Others, however, were more exploitative, reducing her to a headline, to a symbol rather than a person. Naomi was beginning to realize how easily the media could strip away the layers of a complex situation and repackage it into something more digestible for their audiences. Though the attention was overwhelming, Naomi chose to lean into it in a way that felt authentic to her. She knew she couldn't control the narrative entirely, but she could speak her truth. She agreed to participate in interviews, but only on her terms. She wasn't going to be just another story. She was going to use this moment to spark change, to shine a light on the systemic issues that had plagued her and so many others. One morning, as she sat down for an interview with a major news outlet, she took a moment to reflect. The reporter greeted her warmly, the cameras rolling as the interview began. Naomi felt the familiar tension in her chest, but she steadied herself. She had been prepared for this. "Naomi," the reporter began, "you've become the face of an issue that's been discussed for years, racial bias in spaces where people are supposed to feel safe and respected. Your story has resonated with so many people. What's your message to those who feel like they don't have a voice?" Naomi paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She could feel the weight of the words she was about to say. They were no longer just for her, they were for anyone who had ever been marginalized, anyone who had ever felt as though they didn't belong. I think the first thing I want to say is that no one should ever have to fight for their right to exist or be treated with dignity. It doesn't matter where you come from, what you look like, or how much money you have. You deserve respect. I'm standing here today not just because of what happened to me on that plane, but because I know so many others have experienced something like it. The truth is, bias is everywhere. It's insidious, and it's embedded in systems we interact with every day. But that doesn't mean we should accept it. Naomi's voice was steady, and for the first time in a long while, she felt empowered. The interview went on, but her words had already begun to make an impact. As the interview ended, Naomi received an unexpected message from the CEO of the airline. It wasn't a generic response. It was a personal note from the very person who had made the decision to fire the flight attendant. The message read, "Naomi, I wanted to personally thank you for your strength and courage. The situation you faced on our flight was unacceptable, and it's clear we have much work to do in ensuring that everyone who walks through our doors is treated with the respect they deserve. We are making changes to our hiring processes and our training programs to address bias and discrimination head-on. Your actions have already created change, and I want you to know that we are committed to doing better." Though the message was brief, Naomi felt a sense of validation. She had been heard. The steps the airline was taking were far from perfect, but it was a start. The acknowledgement that the company was looking inward and taking responsibility meant something. It wasn't just a momentary action, it was a sign that they were willing to evolve. Later that evening, as Naomi sat down with a cup of tea, she realized that, while the journey ahead would be long and challenging, she had already begun to shift the conversation. She had sparked something, a movement, a ripple effect, that was pushing people to examine their biases and demand better. Her fight wasn't just hers anymore. It was shared by the millions of people who stood with her, who recognized themselves in her struggle. It was a fight for respect, equality, and dignity. And Naomi Carter had just become a powerful force in it. The turning point. The days following Naomi's interview passed in a blur. She found herself caught in a whirlwind of media requests, interviews, and public appearances, each one heightening her sense of responsibility. The hashtag Naomi deserves respect continued to trend, and every day there were new articles, posts, and videos discussing her story, some lifting her up as a hero and others critiquing every detail of the incident. Yet, amidst the noise, Naomi felt a quiet but growing conviction that she had the power to help shape a new narrative. One that spoke not just about what had happened to her, but about the bigger picture of systemic inequality, bias, and the long overdue conversations about race and respect. The ripple of change she had sparked was now reaching unexpected corners. She started hearing from people all over the world, not just through social media, but from real-life interactions as well. People would approach her at events, in public places, even on the street, offering words of gratitude and solidarity. The impact of her experience had gone far beyond her immediate circle, and Naomi began to realize the extent to which her story had become part of a larger movement. But while the external recognition felt rewarding, Naomi couldn't ignore the internal pressure she felt. The weight of being in the spotlight, especially on an issue as personal and complex as this, was exhausting. There were moments when she questioned whether she was doing enough or whether she was prepared to carry this burden for as long as it took. She was no longer just an individual fighting for fairness, she was an advocate, a representative of a much broader struggle. And while the support was overwhelming, it came with its own set of challenges. One evening, after a particularly long day of interviews, Naomi sat down in her living room, her mind buzzing. She had been invited to speak at a major conference on racial equality, and the pressure to perform, to deliver something powerful, to create a real shift, was weighing heavily on her. She hadn't asked for any of this. She had simply wanted to travel peacefully and sit in a seat she had earned. But here she was, facing the kind of responsibility that few people would ever know. Her phone rang, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was her friend, Maya, calling from across the country. "Hey, Naomi, I just wanted to check in. I know you've been non-stop lately, but how are you really doing? You don't have to keep it together for anyone else, you know." Naomi smiled softly, grateful for the comfort of her friend's voice. Maya had been there for her during the tougher times, the moments when Naomi had struggled to maintain the balance between her professional aspirations and the weight of the discrimination she often faced. Naomi hadn't yet spoken to her about the emotional toll the public attention had taken on her, but Maya, as always, had a way of sensing when something was off. "I'm okay, just exhausted, you know," Naomi said, her voice quieter than usual. "I didn't think it would be like this. I didn't ask for any of it, but now I feel like I'm supposed to be some kind of symbol. It's like every move I make is being watched, and it's hard to figure out what's real anymore." Maya was silent for a moment, giving Naomi space to gather her thoughts. "You're doing something important, Naomi," she said, her voice steady. "But it's okay to feel all of this. You don't have to carry it all alone. And you certainly don't have to have all the answers. Just take it one step at a time. You've already started a conversation, and that's more than most people ever do." Naomi leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath. Maya's words were a reminder of something she had been neglecting, her own well-being. She had been so focused on the bigger picture, on the movement she was now a part of, that she had forgotten that she, too, needed care, rest, and understanding. "I just want to make sure I'm doing the right thing," Naomi continued. "I'm not trying to be anyone's hero. I just want to see change. You're already doing that, Naomi. You don't have to do it all in one go. The fact that people are listening means something. Take it slow. Let it unfold." The next morning, as Naomi prepared for another day of public appearances, her phone pinged with an email from the organizers of the conference she was scheduled to speak at. The subject line simply read, "Changing the Narrative." It was an invitation to speak at the annual Voices of Change conference, a prestigious event where thought leaders from around the world came together to discuss social justice issues. The invitation was one that many had dreamed of, but few had the opportunity to accept. The panel she was invited to speak on focused on redefining power in public spaces, a topic that was incredibly relevant to her own journey. She stared at the email, her heart racing. This was it. This was the chance she had been waiting for, the moment to speak on a global stage about the issues that had been central to her life for years. Naomi knew that this was her opportunity to articulate the change she wanted to see, to push the conversation beyond her personal experience and into the realm of collective action. But even as she considered the magnitude of the opportunity, she was faced with a lingering question: was she ready for this? Was she ready to be the voice of an entire movement? The pressure was mounting, and Naomi felt herself retreating inward, unsure of how to take the next step. She decided to reach out to a mentor, someone she trusted deeply. Cassandra Brooks was a seasoned activist and public speaker who had spent decades fighting for racial and gender equality. She had mentored Naomi during her early career, offering guidance on navigating spaces where her presence was often questioned. Cassandra was someone who had been through the grind, who had spoken truth to power and survived the intense scrutiny that came with it. If anyone could help Naomi find her footing, it was Cassandra. Naomi made the call, her voice steady despite the anxiety swirling inside her. "Cassandra, I've been invited to speak at the Voices of Change conference, and I'm honestly terrified. I feel like everything is moving too fast. I don't know if I'm ready for this, but I also know this is the moment I've been fighting for." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Cassandra responded, her voice calm but firm. "Naomi, you're more ready than you think. I know this is overwhelming, but you've already proven that you can handle the pressure. Don't let fear hold you back. The world needs to hear from you. The moment is yours to take." As Cassandra's words sank in, Naomi felt a surge of determination. The fear was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. Instead, it felt like a call to action, a reminder that she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. She wasn't just a passenger in her own story anymore, she was the one driving the narrative forward. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Naomi pored over notes, research, and the personal reflections that had guided her journey. She knew the stakes were high, and her words would carry weight. But she also knew that she wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, for everyone who had fought against the bias and discrimination that still plagued so many. On the day of the conference, Naomi stood backstage, waiting for her turn. She could feel her pulse quicken, her nerves bubbling beneath the surface, but she also felt something else, a quiet strength, the kind that comes from knowing you are exactly where you're meant to be. When her name was called, Naomi stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding but her mind clear. She looked out into the sea of faces, some familiar, some new, and she felt the weight of the moment. This was her chance to make a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or undervalued. She took a deep breath and began amplifying the message. The stage was set. Naomi stood under the bright lights, her heart still racing but now focused, grounded. She could feel the hum of anticipation in the air, the quiet murmur of the audience, their eyes fixed on her. She knew this wasn't just another speech, this was a moment, one that had the potential to reverberate far beyond this room. It wasn't simply about telling her story anymore, it was about igniting something in others, a spark that would propel them to take action. She wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for everyone who had ever felt unseen, unheard, or unjustly treated. Taking a steadying breath, Naomi walked to the podium, her palms slightly damp against the cool wood. She adjusted the microphone, and the room fell silent. The quiet hum of the audience faded, and she knew it was her time to speak, to break the silence that had so long been accepted. "Thank you all for having me here today," Naomi began, her voice calm but powerful. "It's an honor to stand before you, especially knowing that each of us has come here for a reason, to be part of a conversation that is long overdue. A conversation about the spaces we occupy, the biases we encounter, and the systemic inequalities that still shape so many of our lives." She paused, letting her words sink in. Naomi had always been the type to think deeply before speaking, but now, as she looked out at the diverse crowd in front of her, she felt the weight of her words, knowing that they could ignite change. "I stand before you as a woman who has fought for everything I've earned," Naomi continued, her voice gaining strength with each syllable. "And yet, there are moments in my life where I've been questioned simply because of the color of my skin. Moments when I've been forced to prove my worth, even though I have done everything right. When I sat down in a priority seat on a flight, I wasn't just sitting in a chair, I was claiming something that was rightfully mine. Something that, for many of us, feels like an impossible achievement, given the barriers we face." She paused again, this time deliberately, allowing the gravity of her words to resonate. She saw heads nodding in understanding, some faces etched with deep recognition. Naomi could sense the connection, the shared experience. She wasn't alone in this fight. None of them were. "But here's the thing," Naomi continued, her voice unwavering. "It shouldn't take something extraordinary to claim what is ours. It shouldn't take us proving that we belong, over and over again. It shouldn't be a fight to take a seat at the table, or to take a seat on a plane. We shouldn't have to keep validating our existence, our accomplishments, and our worth just because someone else doubts us." The crowd was silent, hanging on her every word. Naomi could feel the energy shifting, and she knew she was reaching them. The tension in the room wasn't one of discomfort. It was the tension of people awakening to a truth they had long known but had never spoken aloud. "It's not just about one woman being questioned on a flight," Naomi continued. "It's about the millions of people who have experienced the same thing, who have been dismissed, ignored, or forced to prove their worth in a world that often sees them as less than. We need to ask ourselves, Why is it that those who work the hardest are often the first to be questioned? Why is it that we are expected to prove ourselves, time and time again, when others are given the benefit of the doubt? Naomi could feel the room shifting with her words. She was no longer just speaking to an audience, she was speaking to a movement. Her voice wasn't just hers, it was the collective voice of everyone who had ever been overlooked, doubted, or mistreated. As we talk about the systems in place, we must also talk about the subtle ways in which bias creeps into our everyday interactions. It's not always the loud, obvious racism that we notice, it's the small things, the quiet moments, the assumptions made before we even open our mouths. It's the look that says, "Are you sure this is your seat?" before you even have a chance to prove that it is. Naomi paused for a moment, her eyes sweeping over the room. But here's the truth we need to understand, we don't have to accept it. We don't have to remain silent when we're mistreated. We don't have to shrink ourselves to make others feel comfortable. Our voices matter. Our presence matters. And it's time for all of us to stand up and say, enough. The room erupted into applause. Naomi's heart raced, but this time it was with exhilaration, not fear. She had spoken the truth, and it had connected with her audience in a way she had hoped but hadn't quite anticipated. The applause was not just for her, it was for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. Naomi stepped away from the podium for a moment, letting the applause wash over her. But she wasn't done. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without making sure the conversation didn't end here. She had started something, but it was only just the beginning. We're all part of something bigger than ourselves, Naomi said, her voice steady but impassioned. The work we do doesn't just impact our own lives, it impacts the lives of those who will come after us. Every time we stand up for what's right, we're paving the way for future generations. We're breaking down barriers and creating a world where equality isn't just a goal, it's a reality. She looked out at the crowd again, her gaze firm. I am not a hero. I'm just a woman who got tired of being told I don't belong. And I know there are countless others like me, fighting their own battles, standing their ground. It's time for us to come together and create change, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who deserves a seat at the table. The applause intensified, and Naomi felt something deep stir within her. It wasn't just the validation she had longed for, it was the realization that she was no longer alone in this fight. She had allies, a community, a movement that was growing with every word she spoke. The conversation was shifting, and Naomi was leading the charge. As the panel discussion continued, Naomi sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She had said what needed to be said. But there was still so much more to do. The work was far from over. It was only just beginning. After the panel concluded, Naomi was approached by several key figures in the movement for racial equality. They expressed their gratitude for her words and invited her to collaborate on future initiatives. Naomi felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced before, this was bigger than her. This was a chance to make real, lasting change, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. In the weeks that followed, Naomi became increasingly involved in grassroots efforts to address racial bias, working closely with organizations that focused on education, policy reform, and community engagement. She met with legislators, spoke at schools, and collaborated with activists around the world to create tangible solutions that could address the systemic issues she had faced. But even as Naomi's influence continued to grow, she remained grounded. She knew that true change would require more than just words, it would require action. It would require people to challenge their own assumptions, to confront their own biases, and to stand up when they saw injustice, no matter how small. She wasn't just a symbol anymore. She was a leader, an advocate, and a part of something much larger than herself. As Naomi lay in bed one night, reflecting on all that had transpired, she realized something profound. The fight wasn't just hers. It was everyone's fight. It was the fight of every person who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or told they didn't belong. And as long as she had a voice, she would continue to speak for them. A legacy of change. As the months passed, Naomi's life continued to evolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. The platform she had reluctantly stepped onto had now become her mission. What had begun as a singular moment of injustice had rippled out into a broader movement, and Naomi, once a quiet woman simply fighting for her own dignity, was now a leading voice in a global conversation about equality, race, and the power of resilience. Her journey had taken her far from the small, quiet corner of the world where she had once sat in that first-class seat. She had been propelled into a world where the stakes were higher, the voices louder, and the expectations greater. And yet, despite the overwhelming nature of it all, Naomi had never felt more sure of her purpose. One afternoon, Naomi sat in her office, reviewing notes for an upcoming speech. She had just returned from a trip to South Africa, where she had met with community leaders and activists working to address racial inequality in education and healthcare. The conversations she had there had opened her eyes to the global dimensions of the issues she had been speaking about. She saw firsthand how inequality and bias were woven into the fabric of so many societies, from corporate boardrooms to government offices, from the classroom to the healthcare system. In South Africa, Naomi had visited townships where resources were scarce, where young people had to fight against systemic barriers to access education, and where people were working tirelessly to overcome decades of oppression. She had listened to stories of resilience and defiance, stories that mirrored her own but were often far more heartbreaking. She had left those meetings feeling both inspired and humbled, grateful for the opportunity to contribute to the conversation, but also acutely aware of how much more needed to be done. As Naomi returned to the U.S., she felt a renewed sense of urgency. She no longer saw her role as simply raising awareness, she saw it as advocating for real, tangible change. She was committed to pushing for policies and reforms that would dismantle the systems of inequality that affected not just her, but millions of others around the world. She was no longer content to speak about change, she was going to make it happen. In the following weeks, Naomi worked tirelessly behind the scenes to collaborate with legislators, business leaders, and educators to create initiatives that would address the structural barriers that disproportionately affected marginalized communities. She worked closely with organizations that focused on creating access to resources, whether that meant scholarships, job training, or healthcare initiatives, that would level the playing field for those who had long been denied opportunities. Through these efforts, Naomi discovered that real change wasn't just about raising awareness or speaking out. It was about the long, hard work of creating systems that were more inclusive, equitable, and just. It was about educating the next generation, providing them with the tools and resources they needed to thrive. It was about ensuring that everyone had the chance to sit at the table, not just those with privilege. One of her most rewarding initiatives was her collaboration with a nonprofit focused on increasing representation in tech and STEM fields. Naomi had been deeply moved by the stories of young women and people of color who had been excluded from these high-paying, high-potential industries simply because they didn't have access to the networks or resources that others did. She had worked with the organization to create mentorship programs, scholarships, and internships that would help provide these young people with the skills and connections they needed to succeed. In many ways, Naomi felt like her work was just beginning. Every project she took on, every partnership she formed, felt like a step closer to her ultimate goal, a world where people didn't have to fight for their seat at the table, but were simply welcomed there. A world where no one had to prove their worth. But the road wasn't always easy. There were still moments of doubt, moments when Naomi questioned whether she was making a difference. There were still barriers, both personal and professional, that she had to face. She was constantly reminded that the fight for equality was not a linear one, that change took time, that it was often an uphill battle. There were moments when Naomi would open her email inbox, only to be met with negative comments and criticisms. Some people called her a radical, others accused her of being divisive. There were even some who dismissed her work as simply playing the race card. It stung, every time. But over the years, Naomi had learned to take it in stride. She had learned to understand that these criticisms came from people who were afraid of the change she represented, who were clinging to a system that no longer served the majority of people in this world. Naomi didn't let it deter her. Instead, she focused on the positive, on the people who reached out to thank her, the stories of change that came from the work she was doing, the young people who had found hope in her journey. She knew that every person she touched, every life she impacted, was one step closer to creating the world she envisioned. One day, Naomi was invited to speak at a special ceremony, an event that would honor the pioneers in the fight for racial equality. As she stepped onto the stage, she saw that some of the individuals she admired most were seated in the audience, people whose names were synonymous with change, activists, educators, community leaders, and lawmakers who had spent decades fighting for justice. She felt a mix of gratitude and awe, humbled to be in their presence. As Naomi spoke, she reflected on her journey. She spoke not just of her own experience, but of the collective struggle that had shaped her, the movement that she was proud to be a part of. She spoke of the people who had come before her, the ones who had paved the way and fought against greater odds. And she spoke of the future, of the generations that would inherit this legacy, who would continue to fight for a world where equality wasn't just an aspiration, it was a reality. "We are standing on the shoulders of giants," Naomi said. "And every step we take is part of a legacy that will continue to grow and evolve. I am not here to be remembered as a hero. I am here because I am part of something bigger. I am part of a movement that is unstoppable, a movement that is already changing the world. And I am so proud to be part of it." The crowd erupted in applause, but Naomi barely noticed. In that moment, she understood something fundamental. She wasn't just speaking to the audience in front of her, she was speaking to the future. To the generations that would follow, to the people who would continue the fight long after her own work had been completed. Naomi had started with one small act, claiming her seat on a plane. But in the process, she had sparked a movement, a shift in the conversation that would echo far beyond her own lifetime. She had done more than raise awareness, she had built a foundation for future change. And as she looked ahead, she knew that the work was far from over. She wasn't just part of a moment anymore. She was part of a legacy.